It was on a deep winter's night, as the war dragged on, leaving the country exhausted and stagnant, that an ominous shadow began to hang over Western Russia. After more than 24 months of attrition, logistics had collapsed on the front lines, and the seeds of a power struggle continued to smolder in the rear. The Ministry of Defense's control had clearly weakened, military morale had hit a historic low, and the political establishment was dominated by blame-shifting and fear, causing the nation's unity to crumble. Amid this dangerous atmosphere, a turning point finally arrived, abruptly. Chechen leader Kadyrov suddenly declared that he would smash through the darkness of the Kremlin, effectively launching a rebellion in the face of tens of thousands of armed forces. At that moment, the Russian Federation was torn apart from within. A crack appeared in the dark, heavy, and stagnant national structure, and tensions across the country erupted like flames. The movements of Chechen elite troops in particular were astonishingly fast, leaving Moscow completely behind from the start. In just 6 hours, from late night to early morning, Republican forces seized key strategic positions on the main road, forcing the regular garrisons there to flee or disarm without being able to offer any real resistance. This clearly exposed the structural weakness of the Russian military, which had been draining its manpower and budget on the Ukrainian front. The flashpoint for this situation was a speech near Grozny. In front of a security force numbering 20,000, Kadyrov took an unusually hardline stance and openly criticized the Moscow government, declaring the central government to be dark and leading the country to ruin. His words conveyed a clear intention for a political break. They went beyond mere regional leader frustration or bluffing. In fact, Chechen militants immediately went on alert, surrounding and occupying military supply bases and federal police facilities across southern Russia one after another. Symbolically, within 12 hours of the incident, roadside armored vehicles were destroyed and abandoned. Convoys of Russian regular troops were stranded one after another along the main supply route stretching from Grozny toward Stavropol, with a total of 37 armored transport vehicles and 8 combat vehicles falling into enemy hands intact. According to on-site testimony, the chain of command was so disorganized that soldiers were unable to even make decisions about engaging in combat, and were forced to disarm in an ambiguous situation that made it difficult to distinguish between retreat and surrender. Such a sudden collapse has fatal implications for the Russian side. This is because what was lost was not just physical equipment, but the very reliability of the entire logistics network. Cutting off military supplies immediately and directly impairs frontline troops' combat capability. Already, the latest data confirms that Russian forces in eastern Ukraine are unable to secure sufficient ammunition, significantly reducing their ability to counterattack. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Russian ammunition replenishment has fallen to 35% of normal levels over the past 2 weeks. And artillery fire intensity on the front lines has fallen to less than a quarter of what it was immediately after the start of the war. Amid this growing vulnerability, the Chechen uprising is beginning to act as an internal fracturing force that is accelerating the rate of collapse of the Russian military as a whole. Of particular importance is the fact that rebel forces are prioritizing the seizure of intelligence and communications facilities. An army without command and control cannot fight, regardless of how well equipped it is. In fact, in Rostov Oblast, the occupation of a communications hub prevented operational orders from reaching the front lines for more than half a day, isolating 6 battalions. The estimated number of casualties among these units is 450, and many troops have been forced to withdraw without resistance. These figures are a serious indicator of the extent to which Russia's leadership capabilities have been weakened. Furthermore, for Ukraine, the chaos represents a strategic opportunity. The uprising has forced Russia to shift forces rearward, redirecting thousands of reserve forces stationed in eastern Ukraine toward western Ukraine and the North Caucasus. As a result, pressure on the front lines has visibly decreased, and Ukrainian forces have been able to launch limited but accurate counterattacks in various places. For example, in northern Donetsk Oblast, Ukrainian forces are reported to have breached 3 trench lines and destroyed 11 enemy howitzers within 48 hours, neutralizing a total of more than 170 enemy troops. This is a prime example of how the rear-line chaos caused by the Chechen uprising is directly benefiting the situation on the front lines. Importantly, these events are not simply a localized disruption, but the prelude to a structural collapse that will shake the entire Russian Federation. Latent discontent within Russia, ethnic conflict, military corruption, and the depletion of resources caused by the Ukrainian war have all combined to explode in one fell swoop. Kadyrov's actions are the first major ignition of this fire, and the potential for a chain reaction of unrest is extremely high. If instability continues in the South and North Caucasus, Moscow will be forced to allocate significant military forces to maintaining security, further reducing the forces allocated to the Ukrainian front. This will significantly strengthen Ukraine's strategic advantage. More than anything, Russia's greatest problem is the frightening reality that no one is in control of this situation. The central government is silent, the military command is unable to maintain consistency in its orders, and the security services are in disarray due to whistleblowing and distrust. If the insurrectionary forces continue to gain momentum while the state's core is paralyzed, there is a risk of a chain reaction of similar movements occurring in other regions of the country. This is not a simple rebellion, it could be said to be the beginning of a structural collapse that threatens the very existence of Russia as a federal entity. The impact of this first wave is a harbinger of a larger-scale civil war, and the likelihood of it escalating into something even more serious is increasing. In the next phase, rebel forces will begin to seize strategic bases in earnest, and key locations such as Rostov and Belgorod will likely become new battlefields. The Chechen uprising was not a simple local rebellion. It directly hit the Rostov Oblast military district headquarters, the strategic heart of southern Russia, and developed into a situation that dealt a fatal blow to the entire national command structure. Less than 24 hours after the uprising began, 12 brigades of Chechen forces, totaling 38,000 troops, made a lightning advance across the south, virtually neutralizing the resistance of regular troops. The speed of this deployment completely exposes the falsehood of the Russian Federation's long-held claims of security and control. Rostov is the nerve center of the Russian military's southern strategy, a key hub for logistics and operational coordination, particularly on the Ukrainian front. Home to vast munitions depots, armored vehicle maintenance facilities, and command and communications centers, it is the heart of the southern defense. The fact that Rostov was taken in just a few hours with little or no fighting demonstrates a catastrophic vulnerability deep within the Russian military. According to local records, insurgent forces seized the main road between 3 o'clock and 6 a.m., and more than half of the regular army garrison either deserted or were rendered unable to fight due to command confusion. Of particular significance was the effective seizure of more than 24,000 tons of ammunition stored in the Rostov logistics depot by the Chechens. This included large quantities of howitzer shells, rockets, tank shells, and anti-tank missiles, equivalent to 1 month's worth of consumption by the Russian military on the Ukrainian front. In addition, 270 armored vehicles and 140 drones were seized locally, and it has been reported that more than 3 million liters of fuel at nearby supply depots has fallen into rebel control. This loss is not simply material damage, it is a fatal factor that fundamentally undermines the Russian military's operational capability. Behind this rapid collapse lies a chronic lack of control within the Russian military. In the wake of the uprising, the Southern Military District Command was unable to even properly deploy its troops in the initial response. Communications were cut off in many places, and time passed without commanders on the ground being able to grasp the situation. According to recorded communications logs, several units were in confusion, saying they were not receiving orders and did not know who their commander was. While the Chechens seized one unopposed supply convoy after another. The fact that the Russian military's logistics lines were so vulnerable is extremely serious from a strategic perspective. And this dislocation had an immediate impact on the front lines. According to an analysis by the Ukrainian General Staff, immediately after the collapse of the Rostov logistics network, the frequency of Russian artillery fire in the Donetsk area decreased by an average of 36%, with the volume of fire on the northern front falling by more than 50%. Furthermore, within 36 hours, Ukrainian forces are said to have destroyed 11 Russian artillery pieces and 17 armored vehicles, neutralizing over 180 enemy forces. These figures clearly demonstrate how much confusion in the rear is weakening the endurance of the front lines. Furthermore, the Chechens did not just launch concentrated attacks on military facilities. The insurgents intentionally prioritized the destruction of command and communication centers, disrupting Russian military operational control. In particular, the occupation of the Rostov military district's main communications building delayed orders sent to the southern front by more than 8 hours, leaving several units isolated. During this time, the Ukrainian military reportedly improved its battlefield reaction time by more than 40% and significantly increased the accuracy of its firepower projection. This is a good example of how confusion in the rear directly affects tactical initiative on the front lines. The Chechen forces continued their advance, cutting off one Russian army retreat route after another in its supply routes. Supply lines leading to the North Caucasus in particular were extremely vulnerable, having been heavily used during the Ukrainian war. These structural flaws were suddenly exposed by the uprising, exposing the Russian military to the dual pressures of both an external enemy and an internal enemy. This situation has had a direct impact on soldier morale, with the latest reports indicating that more than 350 people have deserted in the southern theater of operations over the past 2 days. This chain of chaos holds immeasurable strategic benefits for Ukraine. The more internal disintegration saps Russian troops and resources, the easier it will be for the Ukrainian military to seize the initiative on the front lines. The Ukrainian military has already launched limited, successful counterattacks on multiple fronts, and Russian positions are visibly retreating. In the east in particular, the combined tactic of drones and precision artillery strikes has proven effectively neutralizing Russian rally points. But the true nature of this crisis goes beyond mere military defeat. The fall of Rostov has exposed all of the previously hidden structural instability within the Russian Federation, including ethnic conflicts, power struggles, military corruption, and logistical vulnerabilities. If this instability were to escalate, there is a very real possibility that it could lead to national fragmentation or even civil war. Tensions are already rising across the North Caucasus, and there are reports that security forces are not being redeployed quickly enough. The key issue here is that the Russian military is losing control of the situation. Command structures are in disarray, the political center is silent, and soldiers on the ground are isolated and unable to receive orders. State control is literally collapsing. If the unrest continues to spread, it will only be a matter of time before instability spreads from the south to the center and then throughout the country. The answer to what happens next lies in a new shock in Belgorod. The uprising has already begun to turn its attacks on the security services, and there are signs that the conflict within Russia is escalating. The impact of the Chechen uprising did not end with the collapse of Rostov in the south. The rebels continued their momentum, rapidly moving north and launching an unprecedented raid on the FSB's Belgorod branch, considered the most important of the Russian Federal Security Services. Belgorod is located just 40 kilometers from the Ukrainian border and has been called the front line of defense in Russia's defense strategy. The fact that the FSB branch office, which is at the heart of this defense, was breached by rebel forces is a major threat to the very fabric of Russia's national security. This meant that the entire building would collapse with a resounding crash. The raid is said to have begun at 4:32 a.m. Attacking simultaneously from 3 directions, elite Chechen forces, using nighttime optical equipment and highly mobile vehicles, breached the perimeter security cordon within 6 minutes. Normally, a defense network of over 30 FSB special forces would make infiltration difficult, but on this occasion internal communications were extremely disrupted, and even the deployment of security personnel was not uniform. The chaos caused by the uprising in the south had spread to the security agencies, completely paralyzing the chain of command. It took just 14 minutes for the forces to enter the building. The first wave of attacks left 7 FSB personnel incapacitated and 20 captured, and the subsequent battle for control saw almost no resistance. In the end, over 120 FSB officers were disarmed, and 17 senior officers were captured by the rebel forces. The arrest of such a large number of FSB officials at one time is unprecedented in Russia, and it is fair to say that the prestige of the security agency has effectively collapsed. Particularly shocking was the fact that the top-secret documents and server equipment stored within the facility were seized virtually intact. The internal documents are said to have included data on troop deployments on the Ukrainian front, ammunition supply status, and vulnerable areas in the northern defense network. If this data were to fall into the hands of rebel forces or external forces, it would put Russia's very defense system at risk. The Russian government attempted to cover up the situation, but information has already begun to leak to the international community through whistleblowers. The Belgorod raid has also caused further chaos for Russian forces fighting on the front lines. According to an analysis by the Ukrainian General Staff, all offensive operations carried out by Russian forces in the border area were suspended for 3 days from the day after the raid, and the movement of 4 planned reinforcements was frozen. This exacerbated ammunition shortages on the front lines, resulting in a 26% reduction in artillery fire intensity in the Donetsk-Luhansk region. The Ukrainian military seized this opportunity and launched a local suppression operation combining precision artillery and drone strikes, reporting the destruction of 9 enemy artillery pieces, 14 ammunition vehicles, and 7 armored vehicles over a 72-hour period. The Chechen forces' targeting of the FSB is not a mere military provocation, it represents a frontal assault on the very foundations of Russian state governance. This is because the FSB is a central repressive apparatus in Russian politics, and any damage to its prestige would drastically weaken the state's control. Indeed, following the Belgorod raid, security forces in several regions of the country were observed refusing orders, and in the North Caucasus, some units are showing signs of abandoning their positions and retreating. This chaos is far beyond the Defense Ministry's ability to control, and it indicates that the entire country is heading toward a critical point of internal collapse. What is noteworthy here is that Ukraine is strategically leveraging this opportunity to the fullest. Accurately grasping the situation in Russia where the chain of command has been paralyzed, the Ukrainian military is launching concentrated attacks on enemy command posts, ammunition depots, and supply bases. In particular, in the northern part of Kharkiv, Ukrainian drone units are said to have identified 14 supply bases overnight and destroyed 8 of them with immediate artillery fire. Behind these actions lies a structural weakness. The Russian military was unable to update its intelligence due to internal chaos, and was unable to adequately relocate or disguise its supply bases. The chaos in Belgorod has also dealt a serious blow to the morale of Russian soldiers. Rumors spread quickly on the battlefield that the state is collapsing behind our backs, leading to a sharp increase in orders refusal and desertion. According to the latest estimates, within 48 hours of the Belgorod raid, more than 150 soldiers abandoned the fight in the border area, with some surrendering to Ukrainian positions. Testimonies from surrendering soldiers include many who said, "I lost sight of the point of fighting when I heard the chaos in the rear, and I couldn't understand what my commanders were giving me orders." This is an important sign that the Russian military's control is structurally collapsing. Meanwhile, Ukraine has maintained political and military unity and national morale is rising. In particular, following the Belgorod raid, President Zelensky announced a policy of strengthening precision counterattack operations and significantly increased logistical support and drone supplies to the front lines. This swift decision-making, underpinned by the strength and transparency of Ukraine's democratic governance structure, marked a remarkable display of stability in national governance, in stark contrast to Russia's. The Ukrainian military is steadily gaining a clear advantage in terms of technology, morale, and organizational strength, and there is no doubt that the current internal turmoil has further strengthened that advantage. The Belgorod raid exposed a bomb within that Russia still harbors. The collapse of the prestige of the security services, the failure to control the military, the rekindling of ethnic conflicts, and the widespread suspicion and fear of the nation are likely to cascade and lead to an even larger scale internal collapse. Now that Rostov and Belgorod have fallen, where will the repercussions spread next? As rebel forces set their sights on their next target, tensions within Russia are reaching a critical point. And that next epicenter is a city that has emerged as a strategic focal point that will shake the entire country. There, a new shock is preparing to rock the centers of power, calling into question the very nature of the Russian state. Immediately after the Chechen uprising shook Rostov and Belgorod, the tensions pervading the Russian state spread rapidly to the political heartland. The Kremlin's power structure, long maintained through fear and oppression, was beginning to be shaken to its very core, not by military pressure from without, but by intense distrust and confusion erupting from within. Within the presidential palace, the core of Russian politics, internal conflicts that had previously remained hidden to the outside world were rapidly surfacing, creating an air of tension as if cracks were widening within a massive edifice. The collapse of the center of power first manifested itself in the breakdown of information control. The Kremlin issued 7 statements within 48 hours of the uprising, but their contradictory content revealed a lack of understanding of the situation. It was unclear which was the official position. One statement stated that the uprising has been suppressed, while another stated that armed clashes continue in some areas. In particular, shortly after Kadyrov's scathing criticism of the Russian government as a regime steeped in corruption and shadow, several senior Kremlin officials expressed similar complaints, a sign that the center of power itself was beginning to fracture. Even more shocking was the blame game that erupted between the Ministry of Defense and the security services. The Ministry of Defense blamed the FSB for failing to detect the Chechen uprising, while the FSB countered that the southern military district's defenses were too weak. As these conflicts became more public, it became clear that the Kremlin no longer had control over the state apparatus. Whistleblowers reported that senior officials expressed disappointment at the central government's silence, indecision, and chaos. This internal division had a serious impact on the military's ability to mobilize. The Russian military was forced to divert 3 mechanized brigades from the front line to the rear to deal with the uprising, a decision that immediately created gaps on the battlefield. In the Donetsk region, Russian reserves capable of resisting the Ukrainian offensive were halved, and artillery fire reached an all-time low. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, over the past 48 hours, Ukrainian forces have broken through 3 enemy defense lines, destroyed 37 Russian military equipment, and neutralized a total of more than 250 enemy troops. This represents a symbolic outcome, with the strategic impact of Russia's internal turmoil immediately reflected on the battlefield. It has also seriously distorted the allocation of resources within Russia. With the massive allocation of troops and supplies to counter the uprising, supplies to the Ukrainian front have fallen to less than 60% of normal levels, and ammunition shortages have become commonplace on the front lines. One frontline soldier stated, "We are only allowed a few shells a day, and we cannot even respond to Ukrainian attacks." Under these circumstances, it is impossible for the Russian military to seize the initiative, and the tide of battle continues to tilt in their favor. From a strategic perspective, this is tantamount to the Russian state fighting 2 wars simultaneously. One is the external war with Ukraine, and the other is an internal war caused by a domestic power struggle and a breakdown in security. The external war consumes troops and resources, while the internal war robs the state of its ability to control itself. It is this dual structure that is currently driving Russia toward a decisive crisis. The internal war, in particular, destroys the foundation of trust throughout the country and fundamentally shakes the morale of soldiers, exponentially reducing military efficiency. What is noteworthy here is how swift and rational Ukraine's response has been. The Zelensky administration accurately analyzed the chaos within Russia and rapidly increased strategic pressure by optimizing the distribution of firepower and offensive points on the front lines. In particular, it adopted a policy of strengthening the coordination of drones and precision artillery strikes, and launching concentrated attacks on vulnerable areas of the Russian military. This tactic, which exploits the moment when chaos on the Russian side creates gaps in the defense network, has proven extremely successful. This situation highlights the essential differences between the 2 state systems. Russia's authoritarian rule limits decision-making, preventing appropriate responses in times of crisis and rigidifying the entire system. Ukraine, on the other hand, relies on the flexible decision-making and transparency of democratic governance, allowing it to quickly adjust its strategy according to the changing circumstances. This contrast between loss of control and flexibility of adaptation is becoming a decisive factor in determining the outcome of the war. The collapse of the political center is causing further chain reactions within Russia. Resident unrest is growing in major cities, and security forces are constantly being redeployed in preparation for possible riots. Some regional leaders are beginning to openly reject support from the central government, weakening the country's cohesion by the day. Russia is no longer monolithic, multiple forces are swirling within, pulling it apart from within. However, this chain of internal collapse is only just beginning. The flames of uprising are already spreading from the North Caucasus to the center and then to the west, threatening to engulf the entire country in chaos. If another shock occurs, it is highly likely that the very structure of the Russian state will not be able to withstand it.